Hello students, welcome to the course Introduction to Indian Knowledge System. This video is about folk art, tribal art and modern contemporary art, and how we define these terms and how we develop a perspective to look at these terms into how they develop as an idea. So, before getting into the definition, the meaning of these terms, it is very important to understand the context in which this particular idea develops. So, the very first question, as in who can create art, and more importantly why do we create art, is very pertinent to ask, because the main division between folk and elite, folk and classical, folk and modern for that matter, develops from this very idea. Who does the art belong to? So, I will like to begin with this particular quote from a very perceptive paper by William A. Wilson, The Deeper Necessity, Folklore and Humanities, where he says that art, music, literature and dance come into being not when we move beyond necessity, but when we move to a deeper necessity, to the deeper human need to create order, beauty and meaning out of chaos. And it is this need or the satisfaction of it that explains why all people at all times have had to make music or paint or tell stories or dance. So, the most important idea in this particular quotation is to look at this phrase where he says that why all people at all times have had to make music or paint or tell stories or dance. It also emphasizes the fact that all people do create music, do paint and do tell stories, and that is why to look at this entire idea of folk, which is usually associated with the other of the mainstream, popular and contemporary, the other of the urban, the other of the classical and many others, the many mainstreams that you can think of. So, everybody does create art, and this is what we are venturing into when we are trying to look at folk art, tribal art and even the contemporary one. So, in Indian knowledge system, it is very important to understand that the system abounds both Desi and Margi tradition. By Desi, one means that in literature particularly, we will try to understand this concept in terms of with the help of how it appears in literature. So, in literature it entails to the mainstream Indian tradition, largely dictated by the Sanskrit literary culture along with Persian. The Veds, the Upanishads, two national epics that everybody knows about, Valmiki's Ramayana, Vyasa's Mahabharata and Puranas belong to the classical Indian literary tradition, and this is what we call as and is termed as Margi tradition. On the other hand, Desi or Bhasha, the local or narrative, refers to the regional language expressions, the Bhashas as we understand them. The Buddhist Jataka tales, Gundya's Brihat Katha, Vishnu Sharma's Panchatantra, Somdeva's Katha Sarita Sagar, etc. they all contribute to form a corpus of Desi traditions as we understand them. While Margi is considered to be metropolitan, high culture of the elite, Desi or Bhasha always has remained a subcultural category. But nonetheless, both Desi and Margi form a composite whole to provide a particular system that we are trying to understand as the Indian knowledge system here. So, At the outset, it's also very important to understand that when we talk of Desi and Margi as two separate traditions that have existed always in the Indian literary landscape or Indian cultural landscape, they have not been two secluded separate traditions altogether, and therefore there has always been an interaction and interconnection between the two. There has been an interaction between Desi and the Margi, where the influences and the molds that are created by either of the traditions have superimposed themselves on each other and have influenced the way they have been, if we talk in terms of performing arts, they have been shaping those performing arts. They have been, you know, including the elements that have been either present in Desi or in Margi in such a way that they have always found a new idiom as such to have a, you know, combination of the both traditions. So, for example, if we extend that idea, you know, to folk and classical, there always has been an interaction between that as well. One of the examples that one can think of is the, you know, song performance tradition, which is Kajri. Usually the song is sung in the month of Shravan by women, particularly wherein they talk of, you know, going to their homes, their maternal, paternal homes in the time of in the month of monsoon, where they'll be welcomed, and the whole tradition of it, where it's almost like a festival. So this has been a very folk tradition, this has been a very village bound small community tradition, but later on when the tunes were adopted by you know, more and more people, and it was sung by a larger population, it has entered into those gharanas, the gharanas that have been secluded from those, you know, very community based life where these songs were originated. And now Kajri is as much a part of the classical tradition as much as it is of the folk one. So that kind of interaction we can see in both. And then there also has been an interaction between folk, classical, modern, contemporary. Another example one can think of is by the painter, you know, Jamini Roy, the famous Bengali painter, who had brought together the elements of traditional Bengali folk art and, you know, Kali Ghat Pattachitras in his paintings. You can look at the paintings that he has you know, made over the years in front of you on your screen, which somehow bring out the very earthy color tone, which is usually associated with the folk painting and the community that uses natural colors, earthy colors, because they don't go into those artificial colors, and the kind of, you know, tone that comes into their painting is because of those, you know, earthy colors has been adopted and then, you know, brought together in this very contemporary art that, and Jamini Roy is a very famous artist, very famous painter. So after establishing that, it's also important to now understand that it is very difficult in this situation to segregate the categories as we have, you know, begun to understand them. And therefore, we try to understand how Kapila Vatsyayan in her book Traditional Indian Theatre Multiple Streams tries to understand this very interaction that we just talked about. She says that there is a multi-layered pattern that can be observed in practically every region of India. The arts developed in the pattern of local and regional distinctiveness, which cuts across socio-economic stratification. There is a dialogue and interaction between varying levels, and often there is much overlapping as well. The movement is a two-way traffic and not merely a penetration of great art into popular levels. Thus, there are two broad patterns that one can observe while this particular exchange, this interconnection, this transaction is taking place. And she says that while there is a vertical movement among forms of a particular region at different levels and socio-economic groupings, and another, there is this horizontal movement among regions where themes, content and forms have developed in a framework of continual communication at particular levels. It could nevertheless be possible to identify contemporary artistic manifestation as tribal, village, semi-urban, urban, and delineate the paths of communication and interaction among them in different regions and within a region between tribal and sophisticated forms. So, you can see here how she tries to introduce more categories into this very idea of folk, classical or rural or urban, which are usually associated with folk and classical respectively. So, she further asks is that this categorization based on spatial situation has to be supplemented with historical temporal perspective, where we see the traditions of performing arts developed within the framework of interconnection and interdependence as a self-conscious awareness and a principle, and not as a mere chance that it has been explained and viewed by many scholars. Many a times we view this interaction, this interchange as a chance, but she tries to provide a particular category to it, where we try and study that how these traditions have developed an interaction and what categories further they are making. So, such an understanding inform us to debate about, to discuss, to ask questions on a very simplistic understanding of how folk and classical have been traditionally understood in a very secluded manner. So, after this idea, one can then arrive at looking at the definition and meaning of folk. So, quite literally, when we think of folk as a word, this has been derived from the word Volk, German in origin, and it simply means the people. Who are those people? Where do they belong to? What is their preoccupation? What is their occupation? What is their life like? Nothing is evident in this very word. So, how come this has come to be associated with a particular kind of understanding? And for that idea, let us look at certain definitions provided by various critics, and that will help us frame an understanding of how we can look at this particular term folk. So, folk as a word has a general meaning of people, as we have understood, and in a range from particular social formations, including nations to people in general. In the pre-industrial, pre-urban and pre-literate world, folk had an effect of backdating all elements of popular culture and was often offered as a contrast with modern popular forms, either of a radical and working class or of a commercial kind. In the 18th century, the term folk was more restricted in scope, where the Europeans perceived it as something inferior to their own self. So, this whole idea of elitism, which is the other of the folk, this is where it is coming from, and Williams is trying to point that out here. Then we also look at Alan Dune's idea of folk, as he talks about it in his very seminal work, The Study of Folklore. The term folk can refer to any group of people whosoever who share at least one common factor. It does not matter what the factor is. It could be common occupation, language or religion, but what is important is that a group formed or for whatever reason will have some tradition which it calls its own. So, the tradition of a particular group, a community that it has been following for years, which has been necessarily passed down through generations by word of mouth, by simply looking at how it is done, not as in the official training or a schooling of it, is something that is very evident, very inherent in this idea of how Dunes define folk. Another idea that one can look at is from Mikhail Bakhtin's definition of folk, and how try to look at the culture of the common people, and which is completely different and non-official and extra ecclesiastical and extra political aspect of the world, of man and of human relations. Something that is also, when he says here it's non-official, it's extra political, it's extra ecclesiastical, the emphasis is also on the non-documented part of it, the unlettered part of it, if one tries to look into this very idea, how it tries to understand folk. Now, when we try to extend this idea of folk in terms of drama, I mean, apart from the everyday life where one comes across the word folk, drama is one where it's very commonly present. So, Roger D. Abrams, in his book Folk Drama in the year 1965, he talks about how folk applies generally to a very Western concept of the word, which implies usually countryside or village as opposed to urban, city, and anything that belongs to the cultural expression of the people residing in the countryside is folk according to him. And therefore, when he tries to understand what folk drama is all about, he is looking at this very idea of a very village level community based activity which is performed only during the seasonal festivals or occasionally. So, this is where one can find this whole concept of folk has been associated with it being residing only in villages. When you look at the Indian theatrical tradition also, theatre practitioners like Habib Tanveer, theatre critic like Balwant Gargi and others for a very long time have also thought about folk as rural drama. That is another fact to consider, that a practitioner like Habib Tanveer has tried willingly to incorporate the rural drama, the so called rural drama, the folk drama in his own theatre practice, and stylized it in such a way that he went about adopting Chhattisgarhi dance performance Naach in his Naya theatre. It was Naya because he was doing that particular experiment with folk and infusing it in his contemporary theatre way back in 1970s. So, while we are trying to understand the concept of folk, it is very important to also get into this very idea that what are some of the misconceptions about the word folk, because usually in a very generic way we do come across the word folk where it gets loaded with a sense where it is considered as ordinary, old, rustic, unlettered, crude, unintelligent, naive and unsophisticated, because it is not coming from a school or a gharana or a or a particular part of, as a particular part of training for that matter. And also it's antiquated. I mean, this common understanding that it is something that is frozen in time and we need to bring it out and incorporate in our contemporary art, in our modern art, and revive it. So the sense of revivalism with which such an understanding of folk being antiquated is also there. But when we try to look at the folk traditions as we understand them closely, we do understand that there is a pattern of how things are being done. It is not crude, it is not unintelligent, it is not unsophisticated as one would like to understand it, and it's also not antiquated. For example, take the performance tradition of Nautanki, the theatre of Uttar Pradesh, usually performed in the area of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar and other parts of northern India. When we try to understand Nautanki and this entire tradition, you would find that it is an amalgamation of the classical Natya Shastric rituals that are being performed on stage, right from the Mangalacharan to the presence of Vidushak on stage, to how the artist would enter and exit the stage, and the whole idea of performance that is being incorporated on stage for Nautanki. It kind of gives you the glimpse into how one can think of the folk as a very sophisticated, tradition, and the content also that has been very ecclesiastically drawn from romances to mythological tales that are presented in different styles on the stage of Nautanki, and the traditions, the song traditions, the dialogue tradition that it is drawing from. There is a Thumri, there is a Tappa, there is a Ghazal, there is a Lavani in the musical repertoire of Nautanki, that one is boggled by the cosmopolitan nature of this particular vernacular. So now when we try to look at folk art, and a very important article by Henry Glassy titled as Folk Art somehow tells you about what we are looking at when we think of folk art or tribal art or art that is associated with these categories. The folk art predominantly is functional or utilitarian visual art, which is created by a hand or by the maker of a small circumscribed group and containing an element of retention and prolonged survival of tradition. Folk art is the creative expression of the human struggle towards civilization within a particular environment through the production of useful but aesthetic buildings and objects. Most of the folk artifacts that are being put into the folk art galleries are being present there because the curator has somehow thought of them as nave. The curator has somehow thought of them as containing a more functional purpose than an aesthetic one. I mean, this is how it is usually understood, and it is there in this particular essay by Henry Glassy. He points that out in this particular essay, this kind of presumption about it. But when we are looking at folk art, it is also important to understand what we are trying to understand. We are trying to understand the material culture aspect of folk art, where it is more visible one. Material culture basically points out the relationship between people and things, and this is what we are trying to understand. And Dunes, while he has pointed out genres of folklore, he has categorized folk art into this very material culture, which is also part and parcel of the genre of folklore. So, material culture is also known as physical folklore, and this aspect of folklore and folk life is visible rather than oral. You can see it, it is very tangible, and this is what we look at when we are looking at performing folk arts. This can be traditional music, dance, drama, painting, whatsoever that you can look at and feel and appreciate, for that matter. So, how do we connect folk and tribal? Folk literature is often used interchangeably with tribal literature, although in terms of literature, but also in terms of category, although there are distinctness and interconnectedness between the two. Tribal art usually is understood in a very generic way as rooted in oral tradition, symbiotic human nature relationship, and it also has spiritual and ritualistic element. It is usually residing on or abiding or talking about a matriarchal pattern of a society usually. There are exceptions though, and it exhibits a different worldview, and hence the creative expression that it has is very intellectually rich. It is pre-literate but intellectually rich. It is the sensitivity, the creative expression of the people who have closely associated themselves with the nature that they are living with. For example, you can look at the Gond paintings that this particular tribe from Jharkhand draws, or the Sorai paintings that is done by one particular tribe in Chhattisgarh, Hazaribagh, and this is how the creative expression of the people is being manifested in their daily lives, and this is what abounds when we talk about folk and tribal. Now, when we think of the contemporary time and how folk has somehow manifested itself in our contemporary art, in modern art so to speak, we have experienced that there has been a lot of experimentation where the idea of going back to the roots, going back to the finding an indigenous idiom, or incorporating the folk elements in our so-called urban contemporary life is attempted in various manners. And one way to understand this whole idea would be where Rustam Bharucha has looked at folk as a word that has been used in our modern lives, in our contemporary lives. And he says here that folk has become an established category, particularly in the perspective of Indian theatre. He talks about today. Actors and directors use it freely without questioning its obvious yet diffuse link to the word people. In the context of class and caste consciousness of the educated Indians, it is not surprising that folk were associated not just with people, that is how we have understood, but common people. And in the nebulous vocabulary of Indian theatre artist and his even bigger social consciousness of his means of production, the folk has been disembodied from the needs of those very people from where this particular culture belongs, and quite literally it has become a nomenclature for a wide range of supposedly non-urban performance tradition that are primarily enjoyed by urban audiences. So, this is how one can think of folk. The term urban folk is used by Aparna Dharwadkar in her book Pre-Independence Theatre, and there she kind of talks about folk being practiced in the arena of theatre, and this is where this particular phrase has come from. But we do understand that this phrase when taken away from even from the world of theatre and applied in the lives that we live nowadays, we look at the markets that we usually flock in our daily lives. They are pelted with items, they are pelted with dresses, they are pelted with clothes that have the folk elements, that are handmade, but they are being sold at a place where the people to which it belongs are totally removed. So, how ethical this whole idea is, or how feasible and how rational this particular idea is something that needs to be questioned while we are thinking about folk and classical and tribal as categories. So, as we have understood, you know, that there has been an interchange and exchange, and the modern contemporary has been shaped by the traditions that have belonged to the earlier, you know, styles, but the boundaries are also blurring. And if you look at an artist like Jangar Singh Shyam, he is a very celebrated Gond artist who has infused Gond traditions into new forms. He has borrowed, designers borrow worldly motifs for fashion. You can see it on any piece of clothing, those white colored human beings being painted on terracotta, being painted on a cotton cloth, and this is how they have entered our daily lives. And many a times, very sadly, the origins remain unknown. So, when we think of folk and modern contemporary ways in which folk is realized in our lives, the idea should be to know where is it coming from, to know the people where it is coming from. And I gave this example earlier as well about how this is one of the ways this can be, you know, done. We have already discussed this idea of commercialization of folk and tribal art, which should not be replicated. The idea that it should be acknowledged, it should be an attempt should be made to know the tradition, and that collectively forms the basis of the knowledge systems with which we have lived for centuries and are trying to look at in an attempt to decolonize ourselves, because one of the ways to decolonize ourselves is also, we are doing that yet, is also to look at the knowledge systems that have hitherto been overlooked. So, this is all we had to understand today, and thank you.